Hey, how's it going? It's Keith Townsend from the CTOadvisor.com, and you're watching today's CTO Daily Dose. So, a special head tip to our guest, Yadin Porter de Lèon, came up with the idea of the name, the CTO Daily Dose.
Right. Oh, hashtag CTO Daily Dose.
Hashtag CTO Daily Dose.
I hashtagged it up. The first one I saw.
Hashtag everything. Yeah.
Hashtag it up.
CTO Daily Dose.
So if you guys haven't noticed, this is a little bit different from the Daily Dose. It's not just me. You recognize Mark,
Howdy.
our co-host on the CTO Advisor podcast, and you've just gotten introduced to Yadin, which you might have heard his voice before. You do like 8 podcasts, man.
I had a couple podcasts.
Yeah,
you want a day.
It's crazy. Just name a couple. You've been a guest on and speaking in tech. You've hosted Tech We Trust, which is technically, whose podcast was that? Who owns that podcast now? I think it's like an open source podcast now.
No, that's taken. There's only one open source podcast.
Yeah, there's only one open source podcast.
It's very spherical.
The spherical. And then you have a couple other podcasts. What's the one that you do for Druva? You actually do one for Druva, right?
Yeah, for Druva I do the SOCNet podcast.
Yeah.
And then I'm actually starting a new podcast called the Tech Village. I think it's the first time I'm actually talking about it.
Yeah. So
on the spot there.
So that'll launch in a couple of weeks. I'm super excited about it.
Breaking news, he's doing another podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so CTO Daily Dose. We'll try and keep this into the size of a cup of coffee. It's
How
tough
big of a
because,
cup?
well, I'm from Chicago, and we do
like Dunkin'
like Dunkin' Donuts cup of coffee. It won't be quite that big, but we just had. I thought this would be great, Mark. We're here in Silicon Valley for Tech Field Day 15. And we're visiting customers, we're visiting potential customers. And Druva was one of the first sponsors of the podcast. We thought, who better to do a daily dose with first than Druva? Yeah. And if you haven't noticed, this week on the latest podcast in the RSS is Druva's, what's so great about data protection podcast. And so we've been having this conversation all week.
Oh, yeah.
Which is data protection is kind of the hook for something much bigger than just data protection.
I like the virtual rod there, though.
Yeah,
I got a big thing.
What
can I do with it?
Yeah, exactly. Get the net. You stick it in the net, and you stick it in a cooler.
Hit it with a baseball bat.
You hit your data with a baseball bat. It's all in like igloo cooler, and who knows what happens? Then it starts to smell. That's what data is.
That sounds about right.
Data doesn't smell.
You just don't have the right data.
Yeah. So we've asked the question, what's so great about data protection? And the conversation ends up being, this is not just a data protection conversation. Data protection is a use case for what I think some people label as secondary data.
Copy data.
Yeah, copy data. I don't know what to really call it other than
that's a good name,
other than it's just your data strategy.
I think it's doing more with data that you already have.
Yeah, information management.
That department actually may do something now that there's solutions around information. So we've talked about a couple of different use cases, though. We've talked about, and we went into detail on the podcast, so we don't have to rehash it. But we talked about data mobility. We've talked about data protection. We've talked about e-discovery. We've talked about the ability to do multi-cloud support. It is a very interesting new approach. But you talked about something that was a little bit different, which is an approach to data that's not typical. Before we've approached data kind of at that system level. And now you guys kind of look at data from a user perspective. Can you expand upon what that means?
It's really just where the data lives in context.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the big thing. Context is everything.
Well, and that's what's cool about a user perspective. You get some context about who that person is, what it is that they do. That'll tell you more than, hey, I've got this file.
Yeah, and it's like, I've got this file in a data store, and this file may be mapped to somebody's shared drive, but it doesn't really give you everything in context. If you're looking at context of a laptop, context of a mobile device, same thing with the cloud applications I use. And you can apply that principle to your data center, to your virtual environment, that context, to your SQL server. Where's the context of that particular data natively? and be able to put them all together under one umbrella and say, okay, now all of this is in the context of my enterprise.
Yeah.
And let's do federated search on this.
Yeah.
Let's deliver real value to the different lines of the business, to legal. When you have a legal matter, it's not just this big hodgety-podge sort of, dump everything over the wall solution. When you need to, do like disaster recovery, we need to just do recovery. It's in context. We need to be able to understand whether or not you can protect against ransomware. You can understand that data in context. That data is not in the same place that all your other data is that got hit by ransomware as well.
So to make that super tangible is the use case that I gave when we were in an earlier conversation was around exchange data. I worked for a customer that had a legal hold, and they had to go back, I don't know, maybe 10 years. And the data just happened to be on an Exchange 5.5 server that ran NT4.0. So I had to restore it into a virtualized environment and start to recover. I had to buy the LTO tape. I had to buy the drive off of eBay to get the data back. And I still had to fish for the data because I couldn't. There was no context. Matter of fact, the metadata to even restore I had to first restore the metadata for the tapes before I could even search for the data. Yeah. So we're talking about
restore your catalog first.
Yeah, restore the catalog first,
restores, and then everything else.
And then maybe
from a different tape. And,
yeah. So that in itself was, I think the company ended up spending more than 100 hours of billable hours having me recover data for 5 users. And that was a super inefficient use of resources, but also an example of what's wrong with data protection as we've looked at it in the past, of being, one, the medium was the wrong medium in the past, but 2, we're not looking at this data with any context. There's, I go into a room or I request some data sets from Iron Mountain or whoever's holding my tapes offsite, and it's just a drawer full of media or tapes,
a box that
all no reference
that day.
That's no context.
This came from that day, from this location, and this person signed for it. That's the 3 pieces of context you get, which is almost useless.
Yeah, almost. Pretty close.
It's pretty close, but not quite, because you at least know where.
Yeah, well, it turned into a someday maybe thing.
Yeah.
Now it's an everyday operational business value component. It's not something should we do this, and maybe someday we'll use this data. No, it's like, no, this data needs to be actionable right now.
Yep.
We need to derive value from this information right now. And there has to be a way to do that. There has to be a way to support that consistently across all the different environments within your enterprise.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. You're turning what used to be backup, and I'm calling it backup, and you're turning it into data valuation and putting value to your data.
So, Mark, I love that, and we'll end it there. Data protection is you're looking at these new fangled companies. This ain't your daddy's data protection company anymore. It's more than backup now. We've had a bunch of friends leave comfortable positions to come to startups that do data protection, and we didn't understand it. At least I didn't understand it at first. Now I'm seeing the value. It's much more than data protection. It's about having a data strategy as part of your enterprise architecture. That's it for this CTO Advisor Daily Dose. For those who do social media, Mark, where can folks find you?
You can find me on the Twitters, which I love saying now because
my daughter hates
your
it.
daughter, so that's the only reason I say it now is at Cincy Storage.
Yeah, and you can find me at Porter de Lèon.
On the Twitters?
On the Twitters.
Perfect.
Yes.
And you can find me on Twitter.
Oh, man.
Just one of them.
Only Twitter.
At CTO Advisor. You can obviously find the blog and podcast, thectoadvisor.com. And if you want to find out more about Druva, you can find them at Druva.com.
Yeah, we have a website.
Yeah, Druva.com. Talk to you guys next CTO Daily Dose.